Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for coming to Holistic Child and Family Practices Neurodiversity Affirming Consult Group. We offer this free to the community. And if you want to support what we're doing, please donate to the in the link in the bio that we have on YouTube. And you can also let us know if you want to join the consult or do a presentation for our team. Today, we have an amazing human with us who happens to be a coach here at Holistic and is also in graduate school and is going to be one of our therapists next year. Please welcome Taylor.
Hi, everyone. I'm Taylor Williams, he, him. And yeah, as Marie said, I have worked here at Holistic as a coach, working primarily with parents for about a year. And I'm really excited to share with you all today. It was a little bit daunting trying to figure out exactly what I wanted to share. There were so many different thoughts, and I know this is a really diverse group of neurodivergent affirming people doing lots of amazing work. My intent in this presentation is to share a little bit of the way that I work with parents, and my hope is that maybe some of it resonates with you, or some of it gives you some new ideas and some tools. Or if nothing else, maybe it just reminds you that there are other people thinking about things in radically different ways than the mainstream. So in any case, I hope you enjoy. And yeah, please put questions in the chat. Either myself or Marie will be monitoring that. And we can get started here. Let me just make sure I'm set up. Okay, great. So welcome to my presentation on child-centered parent coaching. I'm going to give an introduction a little bit by way of some of my favorite quotes that speak to some of the values that I hold around working with parents. The first is from Gloria Ladson Billings, an educator. When students are treated as competent, they are likely to demonstrate competence. To me, just this assuming good intent and assuming competence is such a core part of working with children and by proxy, working with parents. Um, I started my career in the classroom. I taught middle school and high school for many years. And I learned a lot about what it meant to strive for a child-centered approach in education. I had a lot of influence from grad school towards like constructivist education theory. And kind of the whole time I was in the classroom, I was sort of grappling with what does it look like to try and bring those things into education spaces, but also have a real uphill battle against the constraints in the education system and the behavioral and adultist approaches that kind of permeate those spaces. Um, when I left the classroom was right around the time when I became a parent myself. I have two kids. They're 6 and 8 right now. And I've always loved this quote. It's from an old book called The Little Prince. Um, Grown-ups never understand anything by themselves, and it's tiresome for children to be always and forever explaining things to them. Um, to me, this really gets at the core of what I hope parents want to do with their kids, to understand their worlds, to step into their worlds, even if they may seem foreign. Um, I think so much of what we do as parents is rooted in connection. And the ability to form meaningful connections with our kids is really rooted in our willingness to step into their world. Um, so I try and remind myself of this and, my clients that kids have their own real experience, even though it may be very different than what we think that their experience is. And my last quote sort of speaks to the concept of disability. Um, I discovered as an adult different aspects of my identity that have really been formative in how I do my work. I am neurodivergent and queer, and I also identify as disabled. And these are all things that I've had to reckon with and make sense of as an adult. Um, And I think there's been something really clarifying for me about that reckoning, and particularly disability, like reflecting and realizing all the ways that I needed things that I wasn't afforded in spaces when I was a child, in school, in other places and spaces. Um, there's something for me that has been really important about grappling with my own disability status, and it's really given me a much stronger sense of wanting to fight for justice for children. Um, so that's just a little bit about how I come to this work, some of the things that I value. And the main presentation today is going to center around three different concepts that to me feel important when I try and work with folks on striving towards child-centered parenting. I know that term can mean a lot of things, but I'm kind of going to focus on these three pillars. The first is that I think that child-centered parenting needs to be power aware. The second is that it needs to be needs centered. And finally, nervous system informed. So for each of these three, I'm going to go into a little bit about what this looks like and means. I'm also going to be sharing some tools and then kind of giving some brief examples of what it looks like to use those tools in a parent coaching context. All right, so starting with power. Um, I continue to be surprised at how little discussion there is about adultism. And so I want to name it explicitly because I think it's such a huge part of the work that we do as parents, as supporters of children, as supporters of people who care for children. Barry Checkoway defines adultism as behaviors and attitudes that flow from the assumption that adults are better than young people, um, and that they're entitled to act upon young people in many ways, without their agreement. Um, Adultism to me is just so pervasive that it feels like one of the hardest forms of oppression for people to actually acknowledge the existence of. Um, if you really start to think about normal ways of dealing with children, whether it's at home, at school, our society is entrenched in adultism. And even as we become adults, the bias and the oppression continues. The ways of being childlike are punished in society. Um, there are these notions of what it means to be an adult, and productivity and things like that, and like these things are held above other standards. So adultism is really important, and it's also a huge part of parenting. There's what we'll get into is sort of this tension between the fact that kids are dependent and there is a power structure in parenting. And also, it doesn't have to be wielded in ways that violate agency unnecessarily. The other reason why I think adultism is so important is because it interacts with ableism in a way that I can't quite put well into words. So I actually went to Gemini yesterday and I gave it this really weird rambling prompt and I was like, make me a graphic. And there's some things that are really interesting here. So I figured I'd put it in there. It only hallucinated one word. So, you know, take from it what you will. But the idea that I try and find in my head is that like ableism is in some ways perpetuated by adultism, and in a lot of ways it grows from it, and it starts in childhood. A lot of the notions of what people should and shouldn't do is rooted in adultism. We project these things that we expect or that we think are better for kids, and then a lot of that can end up being entrenched in the form of ableism as kids go through school and growing up at home, and then after they become adults. So I think I'm speaking, preaching to the choir here, but these things are really important and they are a huge part of the background for me when I step into spaces working with parents. Okay, so a tool that I want to share with all of you, it's something that I call agency mapping. Um, this is a tool that I like to use with parents to kind of introduce some models to think about personal agency. There are lots of ways to think about personal agency, but this model, kind of called the dial model, is something that I find really helpful. The basic idea is that you can think of personal agency as having sort of three dials that you can independently change the volume on. Your actions, your availability, could be physical availability, emotional availability, how present you are, and accountability. So, how much are you willing to engage in repair? How much are you willing and able to reflect on your actions and how they impact others? Um, Consider other people's needs in a situation. And if you think of these as a model for personal agency, we all have free choice and control over how we move these dials as we move through the world. One thing that's important is that every choice for where you put your dials is valid and it's inherently neutral. Um, Different relationships, different stages of development come with different set points. A 4-year-old who's in the phase of trying to form their own sense of self is going to be pretty egocentric. And that's a good thing. And that's also going to come with a pretty low level of accountability. As you move into different relationships, there may be more of a need for different ways that you show up. But there's an inherent neutrality to any set point that you choose. And when you think about making changes to your dials, there's different ways that those can happen. Um, they can happen on your own volition because you want them to, right? There's sort of intrinsic motivation. There's influence from others, and that doesn't necessarily have to be bad or coercive influence. We do a lot of things from pro-social motivation. A lot of things that kids do are rooted in the connection that they have with others, and those are important and meaningful reasons to make changes to personal agency. And then obviously there's changes that we make from fear, or coercion, things like that. And the idea is that ideally, healthy moves involve consent. Consent is something that's really important from an agency standpoint, and it's also something that can get a little complicated when it comes to children, because they're not fully able and ready to wield their full personal agency. Um, so that's a really important concept when it comes to parenting. I share with parents that essentially that they are stewards of their kids' personal agency. As long as kids are in sort of a dependent relationship, it's because they need an adult to help make sure that they are healthy and safe. So there are instances where parents do need to um, make decisions for children, limit their actions. We talk a lot about the importance of healthy boundaries and limits and how those ideally should be rooted in health and safety, and how to do those in ways that, as much as possible, respect personal agency. Um, a lot of what I help clients do using this tool is to kind of map out situations that they might bring into session. We talk a lot about gaps between expectations and reality, from a personal agency standpoint. Um, Other people, when they interact with us, they sort of impose expectations, or wishes or wants of where our dials should be set at. This graphic kind of shows an example of like a gap in the accountability realm. So maybe someone else that I'm interacting with has this expectation, that orange line of like, Taylor's accountability should really be up here in this situation. And for whatever reason, because I'm either unable or unwilling, or there's good reasons for me not to, my dial's down here. Um, when I work with clients, we talk about how, again, gaps are neutral. They're also normal and dynamic within any relationship. And they don't necessarily mean that there's inherently a problem. But gaps do tend to create nervous system activation. And that's something that we try and talk about and normalize and unpack with clients. Um, in the short term, gaps are often, they come along with feelings of frustration, of anger, of sadness, of disappointment, of judgment. And then when gaps sort of persist for a long period of time in relationships and things start to get entrenched, that's when you get more into the realm of like resentment or grief. And um, I try and help clients notice when they're bringing situations into the session that appear to be entrenched gaps from an agency standpoint. Um, and even just that reframe sometimes can really help clients like look at it differently and understand that, oh, like we actually can change something in this situation. And so I like to help clients name and recognize and externalize gaps. And then we can kind of start to brainstorm together, like, what can you do about it? But the idea is that if there are gaps that are persisting for a while, like that's a problem that deserves attention. I was trying to think of a couple recent examples to share. So my first one is a kid sneaking their iPad at night. So I was working with a family, and a parent came in and he was complaining about, I think it was an 11 or 12-year-old son who, knows the rules, right? And but sure enough, they were in this pattern where the kid was kind of sneaking their iPad into their room at night, and it was just leading to a lot of like negative interactions, where the dad would think that the kids are in bed, and then they come in and they find that this kid's still awake on the iPad, and it was leading to power struggles and things like that. And we tried kind of mapping this out on an agency model and just examining like, well, what's at play here, right? One thing that we noticed was that the father was essentially tethering his own needs to his son's actions. So the father was trying to, needed time to decompress, needed time to be done, wanted the kids to make sure that they had sleep, and continued to run into this barrier where the way it was constructed and the way that it was enacted, the dad needed the kid not to do this in order for his needs to get met. And so I tried to just name that and normalize and validate, like, yeah, of course you're going to experience nervous system activation around that. And then from the kid's standpoint, we also talked about how, the way this is playing out, the dad was coming in and essentially like moving the kid's action dial down, right? Reactively coming in, seeing a situation and saying like, nope, this is not okay. Taking the iPad out of the room. Of course, the kid's going to experience nervous system activation, right? And then there was the whole layer on top of it where, the narrative coming in was like, they know that this is the rule. Like, why is it so hard for them? Like, I keep telling them they just need to put it away and blah, 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 right? So there was a lot of just like negative patterns in the situation. And the exercise of kind of mapping it onto an agency framework kind of helped the client and I to identify like, well, like, what if you just made sure that it wasn't an option and didn't do that from a punitive stance, but like, can the iPads live in the living room where you are in the evenings? And can you make sure that you can see them and make sure that they're charged when the kids are going to bed? Um, and it's sort of like, oh, this is another thing to do. Like, yeah, I know you're right, but like, oh, right. And then a week later, the client came back and there was sort of this cool follow-up where they reported like, yeah, we did it. And it helped a lot, and the dad was able to say like, it was an extra thing for me to do, but it made me realize that I'm so much more relaxed when I'm taking control of the situation and not expecting my kid to do this thing so that I can get my needs met. It's a really simple example, but that's the type of thing that I like to try and do with parents is just to map out what's happening and to let the landscape of this agency model help give us ideas for what to do. And more often than not, it leads in a way that's more agency aligned, leads us sort of more organically to discussions about limits and boundaries. Um, and it's been really helpful. Um, Another example was around teens taking care of pets. This was a situation where parents had brought kind of an entrenched gap into the session where, a teenager loved the family dog very much, very much intended to take care of the dog, but, you know, time and time again would struggle to do so. And there were some like in some pretty serious ways, like the dog had had access to food that made it sick and, had to go to the hospital and things like that. And it was kind of another situation where like the parents came in and they're just like, we don't know what to do, like we keep telling the kid like how important this is, and inevitably they just drop the ball. Um, and that was a really interesting conversation. I tried to just kind of learn a lot more about what was going on, and I think the family had gotten the dog when the kid was maybe 9 or 10, in their teenage years now. Um, and I remember there was a point where I decided that I wanted to kind of just push into a bit of an uncomfortable space and ask a question of like, does the teenager consent to being responsible to care for this pet? And do you believe that they were able to provide consent when the pet came into the family? And I asked that not to like say that it's totally wrong to expect that of the kid to be responsible for the health and safety of the pet, but I felt like it was also a really important question to ask to the parents. Um, and it was kind of a hard conversation to have. Like it wasn't totally, received positively in the moment. But it did kind of expand the view of maybe what was happening in the moment. And we were able to kind of shift and reframe the situation a little bit and make analogies to like if you had a toddler in the house and there were things that were unsafe for the toddler in your teenager's room, like how would you handle that? Would you expect the teenager to be entirely responsible for ensuring that nothing bad happens to the toddler? Like, probably not. You might consider physical barriers in the space and like I don't know. And it just kind of helped us reframe things. And at the end of the day, I don't think a whole lot shifted. Like there was still willingness on the part of the teenager to be a responsible caregiver, but the parents were able to shift a little bit and recognize a little more that like they can take the responsibility on as parents to make sure that the pet is safe in the space. And if they have doubts about their teenager's ability to do that, what would it look like to own that more from an adult standpoint and recognize that your teenager's doing the best that they can continue to get support, they can continue to grow into this role. But, you know, a living being was added to the family, and that's not necessarily something that kids are always ready to take responsibility over, or that they necessarily have an opportunity to truly consent to. Um, I'm going to mention briefly the last one, but I kind of want to move on for time's sake. There are instances where this agency mapping is not just used in like a parent-child context, but also looking at like a triangle where you have two adults, two parents in a situation, and a child. Um, and an example that I think of is if parents are disagreeing over like what is healthy food. It's a really interesting example because, again, from an agency standpoint, I would argue that parents do both of them, if you are co-parenting and share parenting responsibility, both parents have hold some of their kids' agency when it comes to matters of health and safety. And food is such a complicated subject with so much behind it, that, there are aspects of feeding that fall in that health category. But there's also wild ranges and different opinions on like what that means and what that looks like. So I was working with a couple that like was having an argument about like, hey, whenever you serve dinner, like these are the foods that are served, and like I'm just not okay with it. Like, and the parent was coming to the other parent with this argument of like, this is about health and safety, right? I deserve to have a say in this because I'm a co-owner in the health and safety of our kid. And it's quite complicated, right? It's kind of a recipe for conflict and argument between parents because they both have their hand in the pot, so to speak. Um, we didn't necessarily have an easy resolution to this problem, but again, just naming it that it was sort of an agency and power conflict and validating that, like, yes, parents both do have the right to object and wield some of their kids' agency when it comes to matters of health and safety. We also tried to talk about how it's not really clear cut when it comes to food. And we ended up sort of talking about some solutions or ideas of like, what would it look like to respect, reasonable parenting from your partner and to give space for them to make different decisions that are healthy enough for your kid. Yes, you can have conversations after the fact. You can share wishes. You can help provide information that you'd like for your partner to learn about with you. But at the end of the day, another aspect of parenting when you're sharing parenting roles is that parents can act independently. And as long as they're doing so in reasonable ways that promote health and safety, it's important to kind of create space for that in the family system. So anyway, all of these are kind of examples that maybe touch on how this shows up in parent coaching. But it's also still something that I'm very much kind of feeling out as I go along and work with different families. Marie, are there any questions in the chat before I move on? Okay. Any questions that folks want to share? All right. So the next principle that I hold near and dear is that child-centered parenting is needs-centered. I'm sure a lot of us are familiar with Dr. Ross Greene, but kids do well if they can. And if kids are not doing well, it's usually because they need something or they're not ready to do something. I want to share one of my absolute favorite articles. It's an article written by Kelsey Olds. Some of you may know her as the occupational therapist. The article is called When Different Sensory Needs Collide, and it's about navigating sensory mismatch. I love this article so much because the principles that Kelsey talks about are applicable to any type of needs mismatch. And so it's something that I brought in as a regular tool in my practice with parents. The principles in the article are outlined here. It's escape safely, basically in times of distress or nervous system distress. Everyone's needs matter. The need isn't the action. Using the environment as a tool and know your own needs. Safe escape ends up being the one that I end up talking about the most with parents, in part because it just feels so radical, right? The concept seems so simple of like, make sure that people have safe escape from overwhelming situations. But there are so many places and spaces where it is normalized, where we don't give people safe escape. Um, I'll share a personal example of this. Back in the summer, so I have two kids, and we were in a period where my kids had pretty different needs and capabilities when we would go out and, social outings, for example. We were going to a friend's birthday party, and my partner and I were like a little bit worried ahead of time that one kid might get overwhelmed and overstimulated and get really dysregulated, and that we would need to leave. We decided in advance that like the risk was worth it and that we could navigate that situation if it came up. But we were also concerned about how that might impact our older child, if all of a sudden we just had to leave and they didn't really have a choice in the matter. So we decided ahead of time and sort of proposed like, I know we're just going up the street to the park, but like, can we take two cars? And like, can we just have this plan where if we need to leave, one of us can take our younger kid home and our older kid can have the option to stay. And that was essentially providing safe escape. Um, and the funny thing was the way it played out was we did in fact need to leave early. We had a pretty good period of time and then things started going sideways and we were able to kind of intervene before we had a full-blown meltdown, but our youngest needed to be less stimulated. And so we decided that we were going to leave a little early. Um, and so I went and talked to my oldest kid and said, hey, this is what's going on. Like, I'm going to leave with your younger sister. You can stay here. Mom can take you home. You can also come home with us. Totally up to you. And the funny thing is that she actually decided to come home with us. And it was a decision that felt good to her. It didn't feel like something that she had to do. And so at the end of the day, like we actually didn't need two cars. But as I was reflecting on it, all of us actually needed to know that we had the option to take two cars. For myself, I was far less stressed and far more able to handle, this building dysregulation because I knew that I had free agency to like make a decision that was in the best interest of my younger child. So I was a lot less pressured and urgent in my interactions with her. My older child was able to make a decision on her own without feeling pressured or kind of like pulled along because of it. Um, and my younger child knew that like we weren't going to push her to stay there if she needed to go home. So it's a really interesting example, and it makes me realize that like knowing that you have safe escape, creating it even if you don't need it, is actually sometimes the most important part of this tool. And so it's something that I name for clients whenever I see it. Like, oh yeah, you're creating safe escape for yourself, or part of what feels stuck in this situation is that doesn't feel like there's safe escape. So really powerful concept and one of the biggest things that I take from that article from Kelsey. I'm going to move quickly through the other principles here, but I definitely encourage a close read of the article. I share it with almost every client, and I think it's great for practitioners as well. Um, but Kelsey promotes, finding solutions that meet everyone's needs, which sounds simple and obviously really hard in practice. It's really important for adults to own and know their own needs. Um, it's not that kids' needs are more important than adults, but kids depend on adults in order to get their needs met. So there's an inherent necessity to elevate kids' needs that is hard. It's very hard. And it's also something that I try and be consistent in helping parents to recognize and to take on as their responsibility. Um, and the last one is sort of the need is not the action. Um, a couple examples. So a kid might say like to another kid, "Hey, I need you to stop tapping your pencil." And they actually don't. If their need is based on another person's actions, it's probably not quite identified well enough. They might have a need for less sound stimulation or visual distraction. They might have a need for more control over their environment. But it's important to not jump to the conclusion that you need someone else to take an action. And if you do, you're kind of setting yourself up for nervous system activation and frustration. It might be a parent telling a kid, like, I need you to put the dishes away. Not technically a need. There is a need there, but it doesn't necessarily have to be solved with that solution in that way at that time. So that's one form of kind of helping parents step back and better identify what are actual needs. And it also goes, from an environment standpoint. So a lot of times kids are doing things to meet their needs, and they think that the thing that they're doing is the need. Like, I need to sit in this exact spot. Maybe, maybe not. There might be other ways to meet your needs in this environment that don't create conflicts with others. Or I'm stimming and I need to keep doing this. Again, maybe and maybe not, right? There may be other ways to meet that need. And a big part of kind of solving needs mismatches collaboratively is helping people on both sides, people who are doing things to meet needs and also people who need things done to get their needs met. And so acknowledgement of this really shifts the conversation a lot into using the environment as a tool. How can you set people up for success? How can you use your knowledge of what their needs are, or what their needs may be, to try and prevent needs mismatches or to create different options when they do crop up? So I think there's a lot of power in sort of these simple ideas that Kelsey shares in this article. Um, Yeah, and one last kind of set of tools that I like to use. Stuart Shanker has written a book called Self-Regulation. I like it. It's a parenting book. It's a pretty good read, and it helps to tune parents into um, looking upstream from behavior. So sometimes I'll work with parents and we'll do kind of a stress inventory for their kids. Um, the Merit Center, which is Stuart Shanker's organization, has some great resources online. These are all linked at the end of the presentation, by the way. And they have these sort of stress domain documents that break out like, here are different kinds of stressors that kids might be under in each of these five stress domains. Um, and I just find that like getting really concrete with parents and even just doing a hypothetical exercise of like, what might be going on for your kid in this particular moment? What stressors might they be experiencing, and which of these things can you modulate? A lot of times that can be really powerful and it can start to shift the conversation to be more upstream from behavior. So needs matter. And the more that I can help parents tune into trying to understand their kids' needs and center those and view them as neutral and meet them as well as they can, um, we're able to work through behavioral challenges that parents might be presenting with or coming in asking for help with. All right, so my last topic is child-centered parenting is nervous system informed. Again, I know that I'm preaching to the choir here, but this is obviously the underpinning of everything that we do as humans, and that extends to parenting. At Holistic, we have some really nice resources that all of us use with clients to help gain better awareness of their own nervous system experience. So we have this tool called the escalation cycle. I have a link to it at the end of the presentation. But we kind of take concepts from polyvagal theory and give some words, some shared language that we can use with clients about, being in the green zone, the yellow zone, the red zone, and also the gray zone after you've had a really big escalation. Working with parents, it can be really helpful to give them an opportunity to map some of these things out for themselves. Because obviously, the more aware that parents are of our own nervous system needs and experiences, the better we're going to be able to show up and meet children's needs. But one tool that I really want to share is a simple one, something that I kind of created out of different ideas, and it's something that I call the capacity action graph. It starts with a really simple assessment of capacity. So the idea is imagine yourself pausing in some moment in your life. You are receiving a demand, right? And I use that term loosely. Maybe someone's asked you to do something. Maybe you just woke up and your alarm clock went off. Maybe you remember something that you have to do. You're sitting with the idea of a demand. Um, there's power in pausing and just assessing from an informational standpoint. How does this demand feel to me? Um, we talk about green as being something that you can do graciously or easily. Maybe it's aligned with your values, or you're just like, yep, I can do that. A demand that's yellow is going to cause stress, but not distress. So red is things that are distressing. You're worried about yourself being derailed, about being pushed too far, about this impacting your ability to do other things that you need to do in the day. And so this assessment step, what is my capacity to approach this demand, is really, really, really important. And I try and emphasize to clients that this is what happens first and that this stands on its own. It is neutral. It is just information. So if I'm able to take a pause in the moment and realize that like, okay, cleaning the dishes for me is like bright yellow, that's okay. It may still need to happen. There may be, consequences for myself and others if I can't do it at this moment, but it's also okay. And giving myself permission to name what my response is to this demand can help me remember that I actually have power and agency in the situation. So the second step is layering on this concept of action. Um, and when I share this with clients, there's a couple messages that I like to highlight. Um, the capacity is neutral. And part of that means that it can be okay to take action in any state. And it can also be okay to say no in any state. If I'm choosing not to act on something that's green, that's great. I'm preserving my capacity and prioritizing. If I choose not to act in something that's yellow and red, that's wonderful, right? I'm honoring my nervous system capacity. I'm listening to myself and my limits and my worries about my limits. And maybe that's going to lead me to modify the task and turn it into something that's going to be more amenable to myself. Maybe it's going to lead me to ask for help or to accommodate myself or to find different solutions. When it comes to acting, obviously acting in the green is easy. Go for it. Celebrate your capacity. Acting in the yellow is what we end up doing a lot of the times in parenting, and that can be okay. But I try and encourage clients to recognize when it's happening and to focus on accommodating and recovering and rationing. Action in the red is one of the trickiest concepts. It is something that needs to happen sometimes, especially for parents. At the end of the day, the buck stops with us, and we don't always have the privilege of um, being as responsive to our nervous system needs as we might want or need to be. So we do talk about situations where action is needed. But the point is that it's important to recognize it and to try as much as possible to make it the exception, not the norm. And when you do have to act in the red, you're going to need to recover. And if this is happening as a pattern, as a habit, it's something that deserves a lot of attention. Um, Let me see. I think, yeah, okay. I'll very quickly go through this, and this is kind of the last main part of the presentation. Some examples of how this has come up in recent work with parents. I had a family that was having a really hard time with drop-offs. Two kids, two different schools in the mornings. There were just a lot of meltdowns, a lot of dysregulation from the kids and the adults. And the parent that was doing drop-offs was having a lot of doubting themselves of like, I don't know, is this really a problem? Like, I should be able to handle this, and they had tried going to their partner and asking like, hey, bring, could you do drop-off? And they were leading with the ask, and the ask was a hard one for their partner. Like it was kind of close to red for them as well. So they were in this perpetual conflict where no one was really getting their needs met. Um, the shift that we were able to make was basically in naming this as a red situation for the parent who was doing drop off. We were able to kind of name and acknowledge that, like, even if it's not happening every time, like, is this a pattern where you or your kids are getting persistently pushed into the red? The answer was yes. And it was like, it doesn't matter what you should be able to do. It doesn't matter what society is telling you should be possible. Like, this is a situation where you're chronically putting yourself and your kids into highly distressing situations. So let's step back from what to do about it and just acknowledge that this is something that deserves attention. And a lot of the shift was just empowering the parent to give themselves permission to name this as a problem and to bring it to their partner and say, like, I don't know how we are going to solve this, but I can't I'm not willing to continue to allow this to happen, and something is going to need to change. And there's a lot of power in reframing it that way, right? At the end of the day, it still did involve coming up with a solution where the other partner was making a shift to their schedule and taking on some of the load. But the impetus for the change was a lot different. It wasn't like, I need you to do this thing and I need you to believe that this is a reasonable ask. It was, I am not okay with this continuing. This is crossing a line of what I'm comfortable with for my and my kids' nervous system needs. And I'm asking you to stand with me in centering everyone's right to access nervous system wellness. And it was clunky and it was stressful, but like they did make some shifts and there were some improvements that were made. Um, okay, I want to talk about a situation where kids have to act in the red. Um, there are some times when this happens and when it is maybe important and necessary for you to help support a kid to do this. My own child had to do a blood draw recently. Um, we did consider whether it was medically necessary, and we decided that it was something that we were going to do. My kid had a history of some successful blood draws in the past, so we had some, reason to believe that it could be done successfully, but the last time they'd gotten one, it was really painful. And so it was like super stressful. Um, and it was a situation where eventually we were able to give them enough space and agency to consent to getting started, and it ended up going fine. But there was a lot of distress around it, and it was really hard for me because I knew that this was something that was red. And um, the mindset shift that I tried to bring into this was A, giving myself permission and saying like, this sucks. I care a lot about agency. I want to give my kid the right to opt out of things that are going to be distressing to them. And I'm making a reasonable decision as a parent. This is something that needs to happen for health and safety. Um, I'm going to choose to be there as supportively as I can. I'm going to choose to create as much option for accommodation, maybe even modification. Maybe we don't do it today. Maybe we come back another day. Um, and at the end of the day, I still did make sure that it happened, and it was somewhat of a red experience for my kid, but it's something that we were able to do with an appreciation for what it was that I was asking my kid to do. And even just validating that for the kid, I think can be really powerful. Um, I think I'll skip the last example for time's sake. I think it may be a little bit more valuable if folks have questions. But before I close out, I just wanted to give a little bit of a pitch for some of the services that we offer here at Holistic and how parent coaching fits in with that. Many of you may know, but we primarily have therapists that work here at Holistic. We offer individual therapy, couples and family therapy. A lot of our therapists do work with parents, with some blend of therapeutic parent support, which is more focused on the parents and what their experience is as humans who parent. But they do also provide things that are more aligned with the realm of parent coaching. And we also offer some neurodiversity coaching for people of all ages. I also just want to put a little plug for a wonderful group that's running right now here at our clinic. It is the BIPOC Parents of Neurodivergent Youth Support Group. This is a wonderful space led by two of my colleagues. And it's a really, really beautiful place for parents to come be in community with others and really get more of the like therapeutic kind of parent support. This work of parenting is hard and it demands a tremendous amount from us. And it demands us to kind of acknowledge and reckon with the ways that we are oppressed as parents. And as much as I work with parents on like how they work with their kids, that work almost has to come first. And if parents haven't had a chance and space to unpack some of their own experience, and the things that they carry into parenting, self of the parent, I think it's really important that parents have access to support in that realm. So I view that as very complementary, and sometimes that's what's needed instead of parent coaching. Um, Everyone's kind of at a different place in their own parenting journey, so we try and provide a wide range of supports. Finally, I'll make sure that everyone can get access to this list of resources. These are links to a bunch of the things that I shared here and a few other things that I did not mention. Um, there's so many wonderful resources, and I love to collect resources. So if some of this speaks to you or it makes you think of other things that you think would be great to share with me or with the group, I would love to know about those. I know all of you have really great expertise and experience in working with families. So that is the end of my presentation. Um, I think I'll kick it back to Marie, and thank you all so much. I hope this has been helpful.
Thank you, Taylor. I will say that I don't have any questions in the chat right now because it is just full of love for you and appreciation and excitement about you sharing these resources with the community. Um, I would love to have an opportunity if there are people that have any questions or even just want to share love. You are welcome to do that now. You can put something in the chat or you can unmute yourself. Taylor, I think that you're just too amazing for questions. Honestly, there was something that was that came up and was like going to ask you for examples, and then you immediately intuitively went into examples. So um, I'm going to give it just another minute to see if there's anybody that has any final things, and then we'll turn off the recording, and then we can have some questions and discussions without it being recorded.
Sounds good.
Bobby Joe.
Hello. So something I know I just thought maybe would be a good discussion or thoughts around is let's say you're working with teens and kind of how do you approach the uh just kind of that process of wanting to help them build skills, like, the adults, parents, or coach or therapist or whoever's working with them may see there's some skills that they might want to have if they have goals of independent living as an adult and things like that. Um, and trying to do that in a neurodiversity affirming way, right? Of we're honoring their goals and their things, but also sometimes they don't know what they don't know, right? And so trying to find a good way to kind of introduce, I guess I would frame it as introducing opportunities for them to start working on building some of those skills. But understandably, a lot of times the kinds of things that are needed, they're not going to want to do them ever, right? Like, because they're not fun things. Like, I mean, I'm thinking like life stuff, like you need to know how to mail a letter as an adult, just kind of adulting things that they might run into. Certainly, they might have supports that they need, and that's totally fine. But for parents, even sometimes being able to start to how they can assess some of that, but also finding this like, how do you find that happy medium of in a neurodiversity affirming kind of approach of not pushing all of these things onto that teen, but also knowing there's an understanding of like they aren't going to know what they might need, or you don't know what you don't know, kind of a thing. And so just curious, any thoughts? Because that's been something my brain's been chewing on a lot lately.
Yeah. Um, yeah, I guess a couple thoughts. Like, I think I like what you said about creating opportunities to do those types of things. Um, because you're right, if a kid has no awareness of like there's a system that we use to mail letters and like there's rules around it, like it may be hard for them to step into that. Um, but I'm also a big believer that like when people have organic motivation and need to do things, they will learn to do it. And I think, a lot of times there's this tension, especially in working with teens, where we as adults feel really pressured to impart certain skills on them at certain times. There's a lot of fear that comes behind that when I work with
Mhm.
parents. And it's valid fear, right? We all have this like worry of like, oh my God, what if my kid is never independent and blah, 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 like it comes from a real place. And I always try and ground myself in remembering that kids are competent. And I think to your point, in my opinion, it's about making sure that they have exposure, right? Making sure that they have opportunities, making sure that there's modeling happening around them, and giving them as much, say as you reasonably can. And like, is this something that you want help with? Um, is this something that you want to learn about? And and I also think there's a lot of power in like scaffolding supports. I was working with a family that was going to be having their teenager babysit their 4-year-old for the first time. There's a lot of hesitation, and you know, they talked about how it's not just like you do it or you don't. It's, what would it look like to do it with support? Maybe it's babysitting for a couple hours with the grown up in the house somewhere. Maybe you have another babysitter on call who can come in it's like to some degree, you don't really know what is a struggle until you try it, when it comes to things like that. Um, I also really love like Ross Greene's resources, collaborative problem solving. He's got a really good way of thinking about like, yes, there can be lagging skills, and those are things that are worth looking at, but they're not necessarily going to be solved overnight. And, you know, you can separate out like what learning opportunities do I create over time for kids to develop these skills in ways that's authentic and following their developmental trajectory, but also what do I do about it in the moment? Those are just some thoughts that come to mind.
We have a question in the chat. How do folks find and access neurodivergent affirming parent coaching? Is it something insurance tends to cover? Like, can it be done in therapy with both parents present and not the child, and on the parent's insurance or the child's insurance?
Mhm. Um, so I am a parent coach. I cannot build an insurance. I'm not a licensed therapist or a provider. Um, we do have some therapists here at Holistic who, I think I think you can make the argument that parent coaching and parent support is in the realm of therapeutic support. There's some overlap there. So some of our clinicians will work with people in a therapeutic context and work with some of these things. I think it's really hard in general just because it's not something that on its own is covered by insurance. Um, and in terms of how it can be done, I think there's different ways to do it. I do like to work primarily with parents. Um, if there's a need to like, do a home visit or observe kids in action and kind of work on things like that, I think that's something that can be really powerful. Um, yeah, I don't know. Marie, do you have any more thoughts on that or like how it's structured? It can be hard to access.
Yeah, it can be very hard to access. I'm going to just speak for Washington State because that's where we're based, which is there is no organization or structure that determines who can call themselves a coach and who doesn't. There is no licensure or any requirements. So it becomes a little bit of Wild West, and I really recommend that people only the primary source of you knowing how to access something is through word of mouth. When it comes to the clinicians, um, we offer a variety of things, all within the therapeutic context of sort of family systems and relational interventions with psychoeducation, especially for neurodivergent populations. And we can do it in a few different ways, but it's generally billed under, the couples or family therapy with patient present, or if we're really centering the kid, maybe we've met with the kid and then we're meeting with the parents and really like metaphorically bringing the kids' needs into the room with us being there after meeting and sort of like understanding the way that the kid processes, then we'll do that as a family or couples therapy with outpatient present. There's some frustrating things. Not all insurance companies will cover couples therapy. Also, couples therapy gets paid considerably less, at least here, than individual therapy does. So it can be kind of difficult just for sustainability for the practice and trying to meet everybody's needs. But definitely, trying to figure out like what is the actual need in this family system and how can we best help them achieve that while not causing harm financially. And we also have a number of interns that can provide sliding scale or pro bono. The way that insurance insurance companies are structured are not conducive to our population, not just for family systems and systems work, but also that care coordination cannot be billed under insurance. So having some other options as loopholes, well, not loopholes, as options is something that we spend a lot of time trying to figure out. And we're
I
very
was
lucky
also
to have Taylor.
I was also just going to share, I do work. I have a coaching business separate from my therapy practice. And so I also sometimes as an option to consider is if the parent already has like an established mental health diagnosis and that, if it's anxiety or something else. Sometimes trauma is a big one as well. Being a parent can be great inroads to doing your own trauma work because stuff will happen with your kids and bring that to your attention. And so sometimes if I have folks within my state that don't, while they may be interested in parent coaching, if they are open to working within a broader scope within therapy, they have a diagnosis, they're open to talking about them more deeply and how things with their kids are showing up. And we do similar to how Taylor was talking, I do a lot of nervous system focused work. And so, but I am doing more direct work in the therapy realm with those folks about what's happening with their nervous system. Whereas if I am doing coaching only, I will kind of name some of those things, but I'm not going to start talking to them about why do you react in the way that you do when this thing happens and what happened in your past that leads to that. And let's work on that, right? It's more of in the coaching realm, it's more of like, here is the education about these nervous system states. Which one are you in? What do you need to do? And that's about it, right? And so that's just another option sometimes to get it covered if the parents are appropriate for that. And it just fits within that. That has been a way in some circumstances. But again, it is a different service with a different frame. And so finding the way to do that, that is still within the true therapy side is sometimes an option for some folks.
I think that Taylor and I have talked a lot about differences between therapy and coaching, and I think that one of the things that you hit on is exactly the way that I sort of conceptualize the primary difference, which is coaching is like in the moment, it's now, it's like relevant to like actions that can be taken, as opposed to in the therapeutic practice, maybe we'll like focus on things that are from the past that are like influencing this, and we'll like do deeper dives, or maybe we'll like do a lot more processing of the future, but coaching is restricted to the now. Taylor, did you have any last thoughts for us before I turn off the recording? There's tons of thank yous in the chat.
Yeah, I appreciate all that. No, I think that I'm good.
Wonderful.